Thank you very much for that generous introduction. I'm very pleased to be here tonight to discuss a topic which the relations between the sciences and the humanities, which is of great intrinsic importance all over the world. But I'm particularly here, happy to be here in Kraków at this particular time, 25 years, quarter of a century since communism was overthrown in Poland and in Europe. And in fact, one of my, I was actually in Kraków almost to the day 25 years ago when that happened. And when the outcome was even then not as clear as it then subsequently became. Many people, my Polish friends, were quite nervous, justifiably so, that this might not really be the end, but it proved to be the end. And this was against the background, and will inform my what I say tonight, of the fact that Poland was the first post-totalitarian country, the first country really to roll back the frontiers of the totalitarian structures that were set up in different forms, slightly different forms, in different parts of communist Europe. Maybe the totalitarian structures were never complete here because of the strength of the church, but an attempt was made here, as elsewhere, by the Soviet power to install a fully totalitarian political and social order, and Poland was the first country to really overthrow it. And I suppose the background of my talk tonight about the sciences and the humanities is the fact that I believe that we are probably now at the start of another period of danger and uncertainty, initially embodied in events in the Ukraine, in which the post-Cold War order that emerged in the 1990s in Europe and indeed in the whole world has, I believe, proved to be not permanent. I believe that order, which many people thought to be permanent, thought to be unshakable, thought to be a kind of an advance that could not be undone, is in fact being undone now. And so that a whole set of beliefs which were very strong in Europe and in America in a rather extreme, and I shall argue somewhat eschatological form, that's to say a form in the work of Francis Fukuyama and the many others who followed his thinking, in which it was held that the period in human history in which there would be fundamental conflicts over the nature of government, and that period it was thought was over, and so the period in which tyrannies could be popularly legitimate had ended. I think I opposed that view even in 1989 when Fukuyama first expressed it in an article in the summer of 1989 called The End of History. By the way, in the initial article contained a question mark. The book which he published a little bit later did not contain the question mark. But I think the initial article, the question mark, should have been retained because what I argued in October of 1989 was that the fall of communism would lead not to the end of history, but to the resumption of traditional history as it used to be before the Cold War and even before the 20th century. That's to say, history as a succession of conflicts between different nationalities, different religions, different ethnicities, conflicts over resources, conflicts over competing interests of various kinds, some conflicts resolvable by diplomacy, some not. In other words, what would happen would simply be a resumption of traditional history. And I think to a large extent, that is what happened. But behind all of these discussions are a number of general beliefs, let's call them, general assumptions or postulates or beliefs about human knowledge and about how we can understand the contemporary situation, the situation in which we find ourselves now. And I want to discuss three of those beliefs, or three of those postulates, three of those intellectual tendencies, against the background of a question, the question which we're here to discuss in general, of the relations between the sciences and the humanities. Now, English differs from Polish in its use of these terms in some respects, so I may repeat myself a little bit or try and explain what I mean as I go along to reflect those different uses. In particular, in English, we talk about the natural sciences, meaning anything from astronomy through geology, through physics, through chemistry. I think in Polish, I've been told it may be more common to talk about the strict sciences, talk about sciences which are applied, or sometimes in English we call the hard sciences. In particular, in English, we often think of the most rigorous sciences, the ones which are the least fallible or the least, or the most rigorous in the type of knowledge that they develop, as being based on mathematics or as consisting in propositions that can be expressed in mathematical forms. Now, what I'm going to argue tonight is, the main argument I have, there are really two, but the main argument is that it is a mistake, an error, an illusion, and one with some practical consequences, to think that what in English we call the human sciences or the social sciences, the study of human phenomena and of societies, it's a mistake to think that it can ever be, or even ever should be, modeled on the strict sciences, or what we call the natural or the social sciences. They are different. They apply to different types of phenomena. Human beings are not machines, however complicated or unpredictable. They have reasons for what they do. They are governed by their view of the world and of their beliefs, right or wrong, false or true. And the attempt to model human behavior, human action, on a view of, on a kind of methodology which is derived from strict science, from natural science, from physical science, is an error. And I'll take three examples of that, and I'll mention what they are before I discuss them one after the other. The first is economics, or what I might call, it's a term which I believe you also have in Poland, economism, which is the attempt to model all of human behavior on economic exchanges or transactions. Some of you who have read contemporary economics will know that there was an economist in Chicago called Gary Becker, who, or perhaps more his disciples than he himself, produced a range of papers analyzing every form of human activity in economic terms. So there were papers on the economics of religious conversion, the idea that people converted from one religion to another gained a benefit which could be expressed in economic terms, on the economics of prayer, the economics of marriage, the economics of crime, the economics of war. So the idea was that economics could be omnicompetent, that economic understanding could be applied to the whole range of human phenomena. That's the first thing I'll discuss. In brief, what I'll argue is that economism doesn't even work when applied to economic activity. That economism is a mistaken approach even to the marketplace, because the marketplace is governed by beliefs, by cultural understandings, by periods of madness and frenzy and irrationality. That markets are no more rational, actually, than other human institutions, which none of which is particularly or consistently rational. The second idea I'll discuss is modernization, what some philosophers, partly influenced by Marxism or Marxian thinking, call modernity. And there is an idea which is still very strong, which is still applied in the West by, not just by philosophers and theorists and writers, but even by politicians and people in diplomats and others, according to which all societies, as they become more modern, become more similar, so that modern societies, as they grow more modern, they become more and more like each other. And in particular now, most of those who hold this argument, hold this view, think that as societies become more and more modern, they converge on institutions of liberal democracy. I think that's a mistake too. I think societies can become more modern and become more different. I think a society can be highly modern and highly barbaric. I think even the best modern societies are morally mixed. Some modern societies have been tremendously bad, like Nazism or Maoism. They were both modern. I would say Bolshevism was a thoroughly modern phenomenon. And Putinism, if there is such a thing, if it turns out that this is not a blip, but is a relatively long-term phenomenon, is, I think, highly modern. It has more things in common with Bolshevism than it does with Tsarism. And therefore, the practical implication, which I'll try and spell out, would be that there could be a scenario, and I think it's even quite likely, whether or not Putin survives, whether or not that particular regime survives, that the long-term development of Russia would consist of a succession of non-liberal, non-democratic forms of modernity or modernization. So Poland could live with a non-liberal, non-democratic, but highly modern society forever. That there will never be necessarily, certainly not a priori, any convergence on Western liberal norms, which is what most people in the West, including President Obama, believes, because President Obama recently said with great confidence, and he doesn't often say anything with great confidence, so this was interesting. He says, Mr. Putin is on the wrong side of history. Well, he's lucky in knowing which is the right side, and he's lucky in knowing that with such certainty that that is the right side. I wish it were true, but I think there's no way of knowing that, and I think it's really a dangerous, complacent, and even lazy way of thinking. The last of the three things I'll talk about briefly is what I call the intellectual suppression of religion. I'm not a religious believer myself. I don't belong to any religion, but I'm aware of the immense contributions that Judaism and Christianity have made to our civilization. And by the intellectual suppression of religion, I don't mean atheism. I don't mean the denial of religious belief. I mean the way in which religious concepts and categories have been excluded from various disciplines. For example, in Western European and certainly English and American philosophy, it's very difficult to discuss religion at all unless you're in a theological department. And what that has led to, in my opinion, is that many categories of religious thinking, including eschatological categories, categories which really refer to a kind of theodicy, a religious interpretation of human history, actually haven't disappeared. They've been suppressed, but they reappear in secular forms, as they did in Marxism, as they do in certain types of liberal thought, and as they even do in Fukuyama. It's often said that Fukuyama was most influenced by the French writer Alexandre Kojève, and that is true. Many of his ideas come from a kind of Hegelianized Marxism. But what's not often followed up is that Kojève's ideas partly emerged from an early work he did on the religious philosophy of Soloviev, the Russian religious thinker, which was about the end of history. And that was an explicitly religious, in the traditions of Orthodox Russian Christianity rather than Western Christianity, account of eschatological ideas in their contemporary contexts. So one of the, I would say in general, it sounds slightly paradoxical, but I believe it to be largely true, that much secular thinking consists of repressed religion. That actually, if one is aware of the longer history of religious thought in our civilization, you will recognize that even the very idea of a secular realm is of religious and in this case Christian origin, going back to St. Augustine. But since philosophers, like economists, don't learn any history anymore, history begins when their curriculum vitae starts, or at least their teacher's curriculum vitae. Similarly with economists, there are very few practitioners in Britain. When I started in academic life in the 1970s, there were many economists who knew the history of economic thought, at least. Now there are hardly any. Almost the only ones left, I'm sorry to say, are ex-Marxists. So Marxism has had some benefits, although slight, compared with the harm it's created. But one of the benefits is that if you've been a Marxist, you at least have to know some history of economics. At least you have to know a little bit about Marx. But in general, the history of thought has collapsed, has been almost eliminated from many from large parts of the Western academy, certainly in Britain and America, and especially in economics and philosophy. So these are the three things I'm going to talk about, and then I'll come to a conclusion. And in each case, I'll be relatively brief because my goal is to talk in all for about 40 minutes. And so we can have then discussion from my very distinguished commentators and discussants, and some discussion with arising from questions from yourselves in the audience. Now, I should say something to begin with about going back to what I meant by science, because I know, again, in Poland, the use of these terms is slightly different from those in English-speaking countries. And by science here, when I say that the human sciences or the human studies, the humane studies, the study of human phenomena, the study of human action, of the human world, let us call it, that the study of the human world can never be scientific in the way that the natural sciences or the strict sciences or the hard sciences can be. I mean in part that human society, whether economic or any particular institution of it or human action, can never be studied in rigorously mechanistic terms, by which I mean human institutions, including an economy, cannot be studied as if they were machines. But I don't take the view that hard sciences, I'm not arguing that hard sciences or strict sciences or physical sciences are necessarily mechanistic either. The idea that physics produces a view of the world as a complex machine is, of course, as my distinguished commentator pointed, is a very antiquated idea. The idea that strict or rigorous science is necessarily an explanation of physical phenomena in terms of laws that could apply to machines is a very antiquated idea, given quantum mechanics and many of the other developments in modern physics. The idea that modern scientific explanation has no room for aesthetic values, no room for spiritual values. There's no a priori reason for that. And in fact, if you think, as I do, of science as chiefly a kind of, all kinds of science as a kind of a range of methods, a range of ways of gathering and accumulating and testing and sifting knowledge, in which the methods which are best vary and differ from area to area, from subject to subject, from world to world, from the human world to the world of life, biology, to the world of astronomy, etc. If you think of it in those ways, there's no reason to suppose that it will produce any one view of the world. And in particular, it won't necessarily produce the kind of mechanistic materialism that late 19th century thinkers thought it would or thought it might. Or even earlier than that, the view of the world as a kind of complex clock or a complex machine which one could predict the future of. I spent about 30 years of my life in an earlier life that I had studying John Stuart Mill, the English liberal utilitarian philosopher. And he was himself, he had for 2 years of his life one of the most, how could I put it, one of the most luxurious nervous breakdowns that probably anyone has ever had, in that he claimed to have his nervous breakdown principally by a nightmare of determinism. He claimed that what led him to break down mentally was the thought that a time would come where all melodies, all musical tunes would have been invented and there could be no more. He thought that in the world of 19th century mechanistic materialism there would be a finite number of tunes or melodies, and that at some point in the history of humankind they'd all have been invented. So all you could do would be to repeat them. And he had a breakdown for about 18 months, which he recovered from. And this suggests, if you are at least a partial disciple of Freud, which I am, I think, that there may have been other factors at work. He recovered from his breakdown when he read a chapter from a novel by the 19th century French writer Marmontel, in which the hero of the novel hears of the death of the hero's father. And he said, at that moment I began to cry and weep, and then I was cured. And he had a very complicated and difficult relationship with his father, who applied to him various forms of education based on the tabula rasa theory of the human mind, which is that the minds of children are blank sheets of paper, so you can write anything on them. So he learned Latin at the age of 3, Greek at the age of 4 or 5, and so on. He also, by the way, this was fruitful in one thing, in that in all the writings of John Stuart Mill, I hope you'll see the point of this in a moment, it's only when he talks about his father that he ever, in all of his writings, comes up with a single joke, except that I think he didn't know it was a joke. He says, my father, he said, believed that if a very long list of desirable reforms were implemented, human life might become worth living, he says. But he never displayed any enthusiasm about this prospect. Poor old Mill. But the point about that is that in the 19th century, science itself was identified not with a method, but with a view of the world. With a view of the world in this as being something like a vast machine. And the human mind was identified in these same terms. Mill annotated a book which his father wrote, James Mill wrote, called The Analysis of the Human Mind, and you can still get copies in good libraries of that, in which you can see his annotations at the bottom of the page. And in those annotations, he's constantly criticizing, without ever really rejecting, his father's view that the human mind, is a rather complicated, in fact, a very complicated, but still rather complicated machine. So the world was a machine, the human mind was a machine, and progress in knowledge consisted in learning how these machines worked. But the consequence of that, Mill thought, would be that eventually there'd be no creativity, there'd be no freedom. Humans couldn't invent more melodies or songs because they'd invented them all already. They'd run out of songs. Now, you might again think that's sort of just a fantastic piece of whimsy or history from the past, but I think many modern economists, starting maybe with the positivists, originally in France, and then in a different form in Vienna at the start of the 20th century, really aimed to turn economics, the study of economic activity, into a strict or physical science of that kind by representing the economy in terms that really didn't require human action, or in which human action was, so to speak, secondary to certain processes that could be modeled in mechanistic terms as the behavior of a machine. In other words, they were attracted, some of them were ex-Marxist, interestingly, in America in the 1940s, a number of ex-Marxists who started to be interested by ideas of cybernetics and early forms of what we now think of as information theory, were ex-Marxists or even ex-communists, who said that they were attracted by the model of cybernetics because it could, if developed, enable economies to be understood as machines. So if you changed certain elements in the machine, certain levers, certain inputs, you could get the components of the machine, which were human beings, to operate in different ways. And in fact, if that were possible, it would be more possible now than ever before, because with the collection of data, big data in computers, the extent of computer modeling that is now available, it would be possible to represent economies in this way. And this became associated with what's sometimes called economic imperialism, but I've called economism, which is the idea that not only economic life narrowly conceived, more or less, as market exchange in markets, but that the whole of human society, the whole of the human world could be understood in terms of exchanges, in terms of maximization behavior, in terms of some kind of rather simple model of rational choice, where rational choice could itself be seen as a kind of, could be modeled in mechanical or as if it were the working of a machine. And one version of that was in the activity, in the work of Gary Becker. Now, my argument against that really is that not even, as I've mentioned earlier, not even economic life can be modeled in that way. And that's one of the reasons, because the life of the marketplace is not insulated from events in the human world. It's not insulated from war. It's not insulated from religion. It's not insulated for the concerns people have as members of nations or exponents or practitioners of traditions. It's not insulated from human passions, as I mentioned earlier, human crazes, human frenzies. One can't understand the operation of markets if one thinks of them as machines. Keynes, whose work has been rather vulgarized more recently, but who I think was a great thinker, compared investment, and he was himself a practical investor. He ended up by making large amounts of money for his college, a very successful investor in very difficult times, including the 1930s, compared investing to a beauty competition. And he said that the thing about a beauty competition is if you want to know who wins, you don't think it's who's the most beautiful person in the competition. You have to work out who the prize givers think is the most beautiful person in the competition. And then he says if they're all doing that, you get to a second level and a third level and a fourth level and a fifth level, in which you're each trying to second guess the other. In other words, you're dealing with something that's George Soros later called reflexivity, in which if you're in a process whereby your beliefs about the market or about the economic affect your behavior and others know what your beliefs are, know that they affect your behavior, there'll be a very complex process of reflexive thought going on, which will not have highly determinate outcomes, but can lead to booms and busts. Can lead, in other words, there won't necessarily, if you take this Keynesian view, be any self-regulating mechanisms, even in highly deregulated markets. The idea that the markets will drift back to some equilibrium isn't necessarily the case if you take this view. I should mention, by the way, that one of the reasons Keynes is still worth reading, apart from his wonderful prose style, which is very civilized, is that, unlike economists more recently, he had a profound knowledge not only of the history of thought and of economic thought, but of mathematics. He wrote a book on the logic of probability. He wrote on ethics. He knew the leading philosophers of his day. He also knew who were taking decisions, Lloyd George. He was one of the British delegation at the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919 after the First World War. He was someone with an enormously wide culture and an enormously wide understanding of the history of ideas. And even of the people who had the ideas, he has a marvelous book of essays called Studies in Biography, which in English I'd urge you all to read, which covers people like Malthus, like Ricardo, Adam Smith, but also people that he knew personally who weren't economists, but people of his day. And so he was never tempted by the view. He was a person of too wide and subtle and deep an intellectual culture to be tempted by the view that economics could be a hard or strict science. For him, like Adam Smith, like Ricardo, economics was an application of history, law, and ethics, together with knowledge gathered about different economic periods and the economic activity over time. That's what economics was. It wasn't a sort of undeveloped form of physics or a primitive form of chemistry. It was a separate sphere of understanding, but with close links to law, history, and ethics. That's why it was called political economy or the moral sciences. In Scotland in the 18th century, when Smith and others lectured on it, they lectured on what they called the moral sciences. Science wasn't distinguished in this sharp way from the humanities as it later came to be. So that's my first kind of argument, that the human sciences, the study, the rigorous study of the human world, need not be modeled on an idea of strict science, which is in any case faulty. The model of the strict sciences, which if it's modeled on ideas of mechanistic materialism of a 19th century sort, doesn't really represent or embody or reflect the state of science in the in physics or elsewhere today. The second idea which I'm going to discuss, which is more topical for obvious reasons, is the idea of modernization, or sometimes in more Marxian interpretations, modernity. And as I mentioned earlier, there is a deep-seated trend, almost a tradition in European thought and in Western thought in general, which assumes that modernization means that as societies become more modern, they become more similar. So that if there is a kind of end point or telos of modernization, it would be something like a universal system or a universal civilization, or a universal way of life. But what's interesting about this, by the way, is that if you look back over the last 100 years, the endpoints are completely different from each other. So in positivism, in the form in which, for example, Comte and Saint-Simon thought it, let's take Comte in particular, the endpoint that he imagined of modernization was a kind of industrial feudalism, anti-liberal, anti-individualist, in which society would be organized into separate, productive enterprises. It's an idea that survived in some forms of Italian, that reappeared in some forms of French and Italian right-wing and even fascist thought. It was the idea that the end point of industrial civilization, and I think it was Comte who invented the word industrial in its present meaning, would be a kind of not based on markets, not egalitarian, a kind of neo-medieval order, industrial order, based on scientific knowledge. Now, some of you who know Comte's work will know that he also believed that he admired the Middle Ages, but he didn't like Christianity, so he thought he needed a new religion was needed, a positive religion, a church of humanity, in which instead of worshipping God, humans would worship themselves. A very dull activity, it would seem to me, but that's what he recommended. And he created such a church. He even created a liturgy which involved the 19th century science of phrenology. It's easy to mock because it is, in fact, rather absurd, in which I think what followers of the positivist church, they had to touch their head 7 times a day on the bumps reflecting benevolence, rationality, and order. They had to make sure to do them all because you didn't want too much benevolence without enough rationality, or too much rationality without enough order, and so on and so forth. And he invented this religion, he had plans, and churches were set up in London, in Liverpool, in Brazil, in France, all over the world, in fact, for a while. And there were a number of leading converts, the English writer George Eliot. John Stuart Mill was very influenced, though he never accepted it entirely. It had a huge impact, positivism. But the point I'm making is that the end point for him was a kind of neo-medieval industrialism. By the time you get to the end of the 19th century, you have a different endpoint in Herbert Spencer. He explicitly argues that human societies go through a range of evolutionary phases, one after the other, and all societies go through these phases at different points and at different speeds and in different successions, but the end point is laissez-faireism, not neo-medievalism. Comte's misfortune is that he lived long enough for this to prove to be false. So he died in despair. Two of his disciples had a different account. Sidney and Beatrice Webb, who founded the last academic institution I was in, were actually educated partly in their view of the world by Spencer. They knew Spencer personally. And they followed the general evolutionary view, but of course by the time they were thinking in the 20s and 30s, it was quite clear that it wasn't going to be. So they became the next point that the whole of human history was converging on was Stalinism. That was their view. They were Stalinist communists for a while. And they published a book which can now be read as a comedy, but at the time had a different significance, in which they said, the first volume of which was called The Soviet Union, A New Civilization, with the question mark. The second volume, I'm not making this up, the question mark was removed. I used to say, and no one ever challenged me that, there was a third edition, which is very hard to find, in which there was an exclamation mark. But that's not, in fact, true. But the interesting thing is they moved seamlessly while holding to the same evolutionary view of modernization and of human history from Spencer's forecast of universal market order to communism. Mill had a different view. A type of liberal individualism was the end point of all modern development. After the Second World War, and then more recently now, Hayek revived a version of Spencer's view. I think he told me he'd never read Spencer, which I am not surprised, because he's a very long-winded writer and rather dull. But his ideas were very similar to Spencer's in many ways, including his dependency on a theory of evolution. And more recently, and of course Marx developed a yet different view in which the end point of modern development was universal post-market type of society. And the most recent is, I suppose, Fukuyama, who anticipated that most, at least, societies in the world would eventually conform to a type of capitalist democracy. Now, the one thing that all of these have in common is that they've all proved to be illusions. None of them has come about. There are particular parts of the world which have been for a time communist, but nothing like what Marx or any Marxists predicted. There are parts of the world which have for a time been had deregulated markets, but not for very long, and they've worked differently from what Spencer or Hayek expected. There are parts of the world which are democratic capitalist, and that's probably the closest to a realization, but only parts of the world. And I think the very idea that modernization tends towards some endpoint, some telos in history, is a mistaken idea. There are many different types of modernization. As I mentioned earlier, some entirely bad. I regard Nazism not as a reversion to pre-modern thinking, but as a modern form of thinking and a modern project. Why do I do that? Well, partly because Nazi racism was supposed to be based on science. It was rooted in ideas such as 19th century evolutionary biology. In Germany, the thinkers who were influential were thinkers like Ernst Haeckel, sometimes called the German Darwin, who presented theories of a scientific type of hierarchy of races in the world. And even before Nazism, these theories were influential in German West Africa, when doctors, some of whom later on went on to train the Nazi doctors back in Germany some decades later, were involved in terrible experiments on Africans. A whole tribe, the Hereros, I don't know if any of you have heard of it, were more or less genocided. And they were starved to death, hunted to death, the women were raped, the children were killed, and terrible experiments were performed on them. And those experiments were supposed to be part of a program of validating scientific racism. So if we take one of the features of modern times as being the tremendous authority that a certain type of science, at least, has, Nazism was not a reversion to an earlier form. It was not medieval, it was not atavistic, it was a type of barbaric modernization. And similarly in the early Soviet Union was analogous in that way. And in general, I think modern ideas of modernization have been used, at least, as they derive, I think, ultimately from a view of history, which is religious, which is the idea of history as a kind of ethical or almost redemptive process, a drama, where the meaning in Christianity is hidden from us as humans, but there is a meaning, there is a providential design. But in these theories, the meaning can be discerned by human beings. It's possible, by the way, and this was said to me by a celebrated Cambridge anthropologist. I've always reflected on it, though I've never known quite what it meant, but it struck me as an interesting. He said that, well, really, you know, we might not need the idea of modernization at all. Maybe we could do without the very idea. Maybe human society, maybe there isn't a gulf between modern and pre-modern societies. That might be true, but I'm using the idea of the modern or modernization or modernity as a kind of term of art. And what I'm arguing here is that whatever modernization is, whatever modernity is, it's not convergence on a single system, on a single way of thinking. And the example of that, as I mentioned, was really kind of rather obvious by now, is Russia, where many Russians in the 19th century, even before the 19th century, Catherine the Great and so on, many of them saw modernization for Russia as meaning becoming more like the West, more like Europe at that time. And I think that was also the way that some of the early Bolsheviks thought of it. Where we tend to forget now that Lenin was a great admirer of Taylorism, of factories in which workers were. He didn't want factories full of Oblomov. He wanted factories which worked very rigorously and efficiently, and certainly saw modernization for Russia as being an assimilation to Western society, and even to some extent to Western capitalism, as it then was, so they could go on to the next stage. And this idea, I think, is very strong in Western thinking. When Fukuyama's essay came out, when I was in Russia, when I was in Washington and wrote my reply to it in October 1989, one of the first things that happened in America at that time was that conservative foundations cancelled their support for foreign policy research. Didn't need it anymore. History was over, so what's the point of looking? And I thought that was significant, and there was already talk of a peace dividend. We didn't really need the kind of preparations against great conflicts that had been built up in the Cold War. Didn't need those anymore. The victory had been won, and it was permanent. So once the victory had become permanent, there might still be conflicts, there might still be serious wars, even in parts of the world, but essentially the ideological conflict of the 20th century was over. Now, I think it was over. I don't envisage myself anything like classical communism reviving anywhere in the world, but what it took us back to was, as I mentioned, the classical terrain of history, the terrain in which conflicts are about religions, nationalities, resources, energy, oil, natural resources, ethnicities, conflicting beliefs. No, history as it had always been before then. And I think that's the situation that we're in now, but against a background in which there are varieties of modern state in the world. Some of them maybe have more staying power than others, but whether or not they're replaced, whether or not they collapse, and we can't know the future in that way, there's no reason to suppose that if the Chinese regime mutates, it will mutate in the direction of liberal democracy. There's no reason to think that if Putin is overthrown a few years from now, or whenever Russia will thereby become more liberal or more democratic. There's no end point, there's no telos, at least none that can be known to human beings. In modern development, there are many different forms of modern development. So that if the forms that are civilized or more civilized can be defended, it's only on that basis, not because, as Obama put it, they're on the right side of history. If you think that they're on the right side of history, well, let me give you an example. Back in the Cold War, when I was an active Cold Warrior, and I don't regret that, an active anti-communist for about 20 years, I would often read Western Sovietologists say that reform was coming to the Soviet Union. And the reasons they would give were things like, Mr. Kosygin was seen wearing jeans. He's a secret listener to American jazz. There are these things at the top which are gradually tilting. And these became even theories, these intimations or glimpses or epiphanies they had of reform. There was Daniel Bell's theory, which was of convergence. The whole world would converge on something like Swedish social democracy. Taken very seriously for quite a while, these theories. Now, I never took them at all seriously, because the background of the thinking is that if you think like this, you'll be constantly on the lookout for signs of the convergence, and anything that doesn't fit into the signs you'll dismiss as just a temporary regression. You say, well, yes, maybe it's lasted 30 or 40 years, this regression, but it's still only a regression. Essentially, everything is being pulled or pushed by some kind of internal processes of modernization towards the same outcome. And the outcome after the Second World War was either liberal democracy or social democracy, or later on democratic capitalism, or in the brief neoliberal period, which Hayek theorized, another form of the global free market, or a type of global laissez-faire. I think that's a mistaken way of looking at historical developments. Much more contingent than that, and they end up in different places. It doesn't mean we can't judge them ethically. As I say, I think we can judge some as being pretty well completely barbarous, and we can also judge ones which have been civilized as having become less civilized or more barbarous. We can make ethical judgments, and should make ethical judgments, but what we shouldn't do is confuse these judgments with theories of modernization. My final point is the suppression of religion, the intellectual suppression or repression of religion. And again, as I mentioned, I don't mean by that atheism or the rejection of religious belief. I mean the neglect of the extent to which religious concepts or categories have actually shaped secular thinking. And actually, many of the, sometimes this is explicit, as in the form of the absurd religion of humanity, which Comte invented. That was a conscious attempt to create a secular religion. He even had a Virgin Mary. He even had a Pope who had to be French. But it was completely explicit. But usually it's not explicit because most contemporary secular thinkers haven't studied the history of theology, even slightly, or the longer history of religious ideas. So they don't know when they're using an idea or a thought. I mean, for example, I've talked with modern secular humanists, and when I say, well, you know, many of the ideas of toleration and of freedom of thought and expression come from within Christianity and of Judaism, they look completely blankly at me. And when I say, well, John Locke was a Christian, and he was also some kind of liberal, but he also wrote a letter on toleration, they haven't heard of it, because that's long before they studied, long before they really know anything about the history of ideas. They're ignorant of the religious roots of modern ideas, which I think are pretty pervasive. Pretty well all of secular thought is a kind of innocent or unknowing or sometimes deliberate repression of its origins in Judaism and in Christianity. Your great Polish writer Stanislaw Lem, who I admire very much, in one of his novellas, The Futurological Congress, referred to a category of modern thinkers he called eschatological anesthetists. That's to say, eschatological thinkers whose goal was to put people to sleep. And I think there is a sort of trend in recent thought rather like that, because if you think everything is going your way eventually, why be worried? I said back in 1989, scale down defense, get it down to much lower, because even if there are occasional wars here and there, which there were, including in Europe, in the Balkan War, it'll end with victory. But in fact, in Europe, the Balkan War ended only because American power hadn't been scaled down too much, and it was an American power which concluded that war, in my view. So I don't want to talk more, but I'll end up with the following observations. The distortions in the relations between the sciences and the humanities are can't be shaken off very easily. They go quite deeply into our culture and our traditions. These ideas go back at least to the 18th century, probably earlier. They certainly became strong. The positivist movement, quite influential in Poland in various forms, I've been told. Very strong in the late 19th century, stronger in the first, very strong in the first half of the 20th century, and still in various, not very obvious ways, strong in the in many of the forms of modern thought now. Modern thought now is, I think, partly constituted by what I've called secular myths, modern secular myths. That's to say, hollowed out versions of religious thought with the elements of transcendence and of distinctively religious belief removed. So I'm not suggesting that these can be thrown off, these ways of thinking. They're very deeply rooted. For many people, some kind of conception of, a progressive conception of modernization, the idea that all societies are ultimately, or slowly, or most at least societies have a built-in tendency to, might not be strictly inevitable, but to converge on a single type of government or a single type of economy or civilization, is their, so to speak, main myth, their main religious belief. It's true in many modern societies. And I don't think it's actually possible to shake it off. The most that can be done is to be aware of the limitations and flaws in this way of thinking. There are no solutions, is my view, just partial remedies to these mistaken forms of understanding. Partial remedies, if you like, for a disease that's itself incurable, which is a certain type of modern mythology, which is a part deeply encrypted in our culture. And the most we can do is turn back to the history of thought, which I've been constantly referring to, just to know that hasn't always been the case that we've thought like this. And even when we have thought like this, we've had more subtle forms of economic thinking, we've had more subtle forms of the human sciences than we have now. And also the more general conclusion is that what I call epistemological pluralism, which is to say that different forms of human knowledge have different types of rigor. As Aristotle said, we shouldn't look in a subject for more rigor than it's capable. I would put that slightly differently and say we should look at each subject for the best kind of rigor that's appropriate to that subject, which will be different in different subjects. And what we now think of the human sciences, I think, are better conceived of as forms of study related to ethics, to politics, to religion, to literature, even to poetry, as much as they are to anything that we now call the strict sciences. So thank you very much.